The judge's gavel slammed down like a death knell, shattering the heavy silence that blanketed the courtroom. Every eye turned toward the 66-year-old black man in handcuffs, Daniel Rigg, a former Marine sniper, a man who carried over 20 scars for his country, now standing trial for charges that should never have existed. Outside, chants of justice for Daniel echoed off the cold gray concrete walls of the courthouse. Protesters clutched signs in the biting wind, their eyes burning with anger and the belief that truth still had a chance to be heard. But what they didn't know was that in exactly 12 minutes, a military helicopter would land right on the courthouse steps. On board was General Samuel Wyatt, the only man who held the key to uncovering a truth buried for half a century. Would he arrive in time to prevent the greatest injustice of Rigg's life? Or would history once again play its cruel, twisted game? What would it feel like to dedicate your entire life to your country, only to be betrayed by it? Have you ever seen a hero treated like a criminal? Share your thoughts in the comments, because maybe, just maybe, this story will awaken something long buried in the conscience of our society. Before we dive deeper into this story of courage, heartbreak, and redemption, don't forget to support the channel by hitting like and subscribing. In tomorrow's special episode, you'll uncover a classified file that once triggered an emergency session of the United States Senate. But first, let's rewind to 3 weeks earlier, when fate took a sharp turn. "Oh, probably lives off government aid," Jake muttered, half laughing, half sneering as he slid into the booth. "My dad says guys like him just hang around cheap diners because they've got nowhere else to go." Daniel Rigg carefully folded his newspaper, each movement deliberate, like he was preserving a battlefield memory. He set it aside and looked up. "Good men," he said, his voice deep and steady, each word landing like the march of boots. "Measured, disciplined. I'm not looking for trouble. Just asking if you could lower your voices a bit so folks can enjoy their breakfast." His words were calm and dignified, just as he had been trained through decades of military service. But to Tyler, it felt like a slap in the face, a challenge to the ego of someone who had never been called out before. His face turned red, not just from anger, but from something more dangerous, the sting of being corrected by someone he viewed as beneath him. He jumped to his feet and barked. "Did this old man just give us an order?" He said it loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "He's threatening us. This scary old black guy is trying to intimidate us." Daniel remained seated. His hands rested clearly on the table, making no sudden moves. "I simply asked you to speak a little more quietly, that's all," he said, his voice eerily calm. "He's threatening us." Brett chimed in immediately, whipping out his phone and starting to record. "A deranged vet is threatening innocent civilians? Someone call the cops." Maria, the longtime waitress behind the counter, stepped out, trembling. Her eyes pleaded with the officers who hadn't even arrived yet. "That's not what happened. Mr. Rigg was polite. He just asked them to lower their voices. He didn't threaten anyone." But Tyler had already called 911. His voice now took on an exaggerated, panicked tone, so over the top it would have been laughable if it weren't so serious. "Help! There's a dangerous black man in Murphy's diner. He's threatening us. Might have a weapon. Please send help." A chill shot down Daniel's spine. He knew this feeling all too well. It was the same cold jolt he'd felt before a Viet Cong ambush in the jungle, when a single misplaced leaf could mean death. He had survived 3 brutal campaigns, earned a Silver Star and a Purple Heart, and taught thousands of students about American history, the very history now being twisted against him. Just 4 minutes later, sirens screamed through the air. 3 police cruisers screeched to a halt outside the small diner. Officers Michael Patterson and Jennifer Walsh burst through the doors, hands on their holsters, eyes scanning like soldiers entering hostile territory. Their gaze locked instantly onto Daniel, the only black man in the room. Their posture shifted into takedown mode. "That's him," Tyler pointed, playing the perfect victim in a cheap school play. "He said he'd make us disappear. He knows how. Daniel had never said such things, but no one asked him. They didn't need to. Officer Patterson, who had a long record of racial bias complaints, stepped forward, hands still on his weapon. "Stand up slowly and place your hands behind your back," he barked, his tone hard as iron. "Officer." Daniel replied, still calm though weariness tinged his voice. He stood slowly, following every instruction. "There must be some misunderstanding. I only asked them to quiet down. I never threatened anyone. What do you think happens next? How does a war hero who once taught generations about justice and truth end up in handcuffs, betrayed by the very values he upheld? If you've ever witnessed such injustice, share your story. You never know. Your voice might help change someone's silence." "Save it for the judge," Officer Patterson growled, then suddenly twisted Daniel's arms behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs snapped through the air, cold and unforgiving against skin weathered by years of war. Steel bit into flesh. "You're under arrest for making terroristic threats and disturbing the peace." "That's not true," Maria shouted, standing again. "I saw everything. Mr. Rigg didn't threaten anyone. Those 3 kids were drunk and being loud. He just wanted his breakfast like always." But Officer Walsh waved her off with cold detachment, brushing aside the truth like an inconvenience. "And please step back and let us do our job. Multiple witnesses claim this man threatened them." "Witnesses? Just 3 boys who fabricated the entire story like a middle school drama. And somehow, their words held more weight than the truth, simply because of the color of their skin." The purple heart on Daniel's chest, a symbol of bravery and battlefield wounds, became invisible to those who saw only a black man accused by white teenagers. As he was escorted toward the door, Daniel's Marine Corps cap fell to the tiled floor, landing next to the newspaper he hadn't finished reading. Its front page headline read bitterly, "Honoring local veterans for their service." And yet, beneath that very headline, a hero was being treated like a criminal. Do you see the paradox here? A country that honors its veterans with ceremonial reverence yet lets them quietly fall through the cracks of everyday life, all because of a single false phone call? Share your thoughts. Are we truly defending the values we promised? The ride to Marin County Jail lasted exactly 12 minutes. The entire way, Patterson and Walsh talked about Daniel as if he didn't exist, as if he were just an object being escorted. "Probably one of those unstable vets like the ones we heard about in training," one muttered. "Bet his file's full of priors," the other chimed in. Daniel stayed silent. He knew all too well that sometimes silence is the only shield left against violence and prejudice. At the jail, Daniel was treated like any other suspect. Fingerprints, mugshot. That photo would be on the evening news, right next to the smiling faces of the 3 so-called victims. His belongings were processed like lifeless inventory. A wallet with $43, a set of keys, and a faded photograph of his late wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Michelle. His purple heart was reduced to a line in the report. Decorative pin. 2 hours later, formal charges were filed. Second-degree terroristic threats and public disorder. Bail was set at $50,000. For a man living on military and Social Security benefits, it might as well have been $50 million. That night, the local news exploded with the headline, "Veteran Threatens Group of Teens at Downtown Diner," featuring Daniel's mugshot alongside yearbook staple portraits of Tyler, Jake, and Brett. The narrative was set long before Daniel ever got to speak to a lawyer. Dangerous black veteran threatens innocent white college students. No mention of the teens being drunk, disruptive, or dishonest. The news wanted views, not the truth. That first night, Daniel lay awake in a small holding cell with 2 other pretrial detainees. He stared at the cracked ceiling, unable to sleep. Not because of the cold concrete walls, but because he knew this fight was in a new kind of trench, against bias, media distortion, and the silence of justice. If you're a lawyer, a news viewer, or just a citizen who cares about truth, what would you do when you see someone swept into the gears of prejudice like this? Leave a comment. Your voice might be the one that changes the fate of those left behind. Lying on a thin, torn mattress, Daniel Riggs stared at the fractured ceiling. In that damp, musty air, his thoughts turned to the country he had once shed blood to defend. 4 years in the jungles of Vietnam, decades teaching young people about justice, democracy, and the Constitution. And yet here, in a silent jail cell, he couldn't help but wonder, did the America he fought for ever truly exist? Or was it just a beautiful dream, endlessly deferred, for people who looked like him? Have you ever felt a deep, personal belief betray you? When everything you spent your life defending suddenly turns its back on you? While Daniel faced his first long night at Marin County Jail, the outside world began to stir. His upcoming trial drew unprecedented media attention, catching even seasoned reporters off guard. When his arraignment took place 3 days after the arrest, hundreds of protesters, divided into 2 opposing camps, filled the courthouse steps. The tension was so high that law enforcement doubled security in anticipation of unrest. Daniel's court-appointed defense attorney was Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the officer who arrested him. Fresh out of law school, Jennifer was drowning in over 100 active cases at the public defender's office. She had just 40 minutes to review his file before stepping into the concrete interview room where Daniel sat in an orange jumpsuit, his gaze calm but resolute, like a man who'd once stared down enemy rifles. "Mr. Riggs," she began, flipping through the file riddled with holes and inconsistencies. "The prosecution has 3 witnesses claiming you used violent language to threaten them. That's going to be hard to dispute." Daniel didn't flinch. He looked straight into her eyes, the eyes of someone who had survived war and loss. "Ms. Walsh, I never threatened anyone. I simply asked them to lower their voices, politely. That's all." "I understand that's your version of events," she replied, her voice tired and edged with frustration. "But the reality is this case is under intense public scrutiny. And more importantly, Prosecutor Rebecca Carlisle is personally leading it, which means she sees it as a political opportunity." What Daniel didn't know was that Rebecca Carlisle was running for mayor. Her campaign slogan? Tough on crime. And Daniel's case, a dangerous black veteran, had become a centerpiece of her strategy. Recent polls showed Carlisle trailing her opponent by 8 percentage points, and a high-profile conviction could turn things around. The preliminary hearing was held in Judge Robert Morrison's courtroom, a stately wood-paneled chamber that had seen over 6 decades of Indianapolis justice. Morrison, a white man in his 70s, was known for being quick and efficient. But that speed often came at a cost. Key evidence sometimes got dismissed before being fully examined. Jury selection, which should have been a procedural step, turned into Daniel Riggs' first major obstacle. The jury pool was drawn from Marin County's voter rolls, an area predominantly made up of white suburban residents. And while both attorneys were allowed to ask basic questions about objectivity, deeper inquiries into racial bias were dismissed by Judge Morrison as irrelevant. The final jury, 10 white jurors, 1 Latina woman, and a single black man, a security guard by profession. During the selection process, some prospective jurors openly expressed skepticism toward veterans, especially those who had served in Vietnam. "Guys like that come back messed up in the head," one nominee had said. "You never know when they're going to snap." How would you feel if the people deciding your fate came from a world that never understood what you sacrificed? The media didn't stay on the sidelines. Channel 8 sent legal analyst and former prosecutor David Kelly to appear on the evening news to break down the case. But instead of offering a balanced view, he fixated on one thing: the threat posed by a combat veteran. "These men are trained killers. They've seen violence the average person couldn't even imagine," Kelly declared. "When cornered, their instincts can kick in, and the results are often deadly." And what about the fact that Daniel was once awarded for his bravery and spent over 30 years teaching history and human rights? It was mentioned only in passing, like a footnote in a documentary that missed the point. The narrative had already been locked in, a dangerous veteran threatening innocent civilians. 3 days before the trial, Daniel's daughter Michelle drove in from Chicago. She was a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital and had to take unpaid leave to attend her father's hearing, even though it put an extra financial strain on her family. "Dad," Michelle said during visiting hours at the jail, "I found a private attorney, Gerald Watson. He specializes in discrimination cases. He believes we can sue under the Civil Rights Act after this is over." Daniel shook his head softly, a faint, sad smile crossing his lips. "Michelle, sweetheart, I can't let you spend your savings on a battle we might not win. His retainer alone is more than my monthly pension. This isn't about money anymore, Dad. This is about justice. You served this country for 4 years, taught the Constitution and civil rights for 30. You don't deserve this." But Daniel understood, and now Michelle was beginning to understand, that justice wasn't something guaranteed for everyone. It was often a privilege reserved for those with money, power, and influence. Hiring a private attorney like Watson required a retainer of at least $25,000, 0 cents. A sum neither Daniel nor his daughter could afford, even if they sold everything they had left. Meanwhile, the media continued to pour fuel on the fire. Every night the news replayed Daniel's mugshot, labeling him accused veteran. They barely mentioned the inconsistencies in the charges, focusing instead on the combat vet with the potential for violence. Tyler Morrison's family, the one who had triggered the entire incident, even hired a professional public relations firm to manage the narrative. As a result, Tyler's image was carefully rebuilt for the public, an innocent victim threatened by an unstable soldier, rather than a privileged drunken teen who had lied. 3 days before the trial, Channel 13 aired a special report, and for the full 90 seconds of airtime, Daniel Rigg's name was accompanied by a single word: dangerous. The segment was titled "When Veterans Attack" and aired precisely 3 days before trial. A lineup of psychologists offered commentary, none of whom had ever met Daniel Rigg. Yet each speculated freely about the kind of trauma that might trigger violent behavior. Vietnam veterans often carry deep psychological scars, and it can take decades before those wounds surface, said Dr. Amanda Foster, an expert in PTSD. Even seemingly minor incidents can reactivate combat memories, making them respond as if they're... As her voice played, the screen cut to grainy Vietnam War footage. Helicopters, gunfire, soldiers falling in red mud. Each frame cast the shadow of war over Daniel's upcoming trial. Despite how far that imagery strayed from the truth, no one mentioned Daniel's 3 decades of teaching at a community college. No one spoke of the free literacy programs he volunteered for, or his spotless legal record. Meanwhile, the 3 teens were portrayed as innocent boys traumatized by a trained killing machine. Tyler Morrison even appeared on several local talk shows, his face pale, eyes wide with fear as he recounted his encounter with a soldier who could snap at any moment. The script repeated itself again and again, though no one paused to ask if any of it was true. Outside the courthouse, another kind of standoff unfolded daily. On one side were veterans from across the Midwest, driving hours just to stand in silence, wearing their uniforms and holding signs, "Honor our veterans, justice for Daniel Rigg." On the other side were community groups waving banners, "Protect our children, keep them safe from violent vets." 2 lines of people divided by police barricades, staring each other down in tense silence. Some prayed, some clenched fists, holding back a storm of rage. Politicians jumped in, each calculating the political gain behind every word. Incumbent Mayor James Harrison, a Democrat, issued a carefully worded statement calling for calm and respect for due process. Meanwhile, his Republican opponent, Susan Martinez, held a press conference on the courthouse steps, demanding the maximum penalty for anyone who threatens our youth. The trial hadn't even started, but Daniel Rigg had already become a symbol, not of the man himself, but of political agendas, societal divides, and deep-seated bias. In this circus-like atmosphere, the truth of what actually happened at Murphy's Diner that morning had almost completely vanished. Inside his brightly lit jail cell, where the lights never went off, Daniel pored over legal documents under harsh fluorescent glare. Each page reminded him that this battle had no map, no trenches, only himself against a system full of cracks. He thought of his fellow Marines in Vietnam, the ones who never came home, the ones who did, only to be shunned by the very country they fought to protect. And now, 50 years later, he still bore those wounds. But this time, they were wounds to his dignity and his spirit. His Purple Heart, the medal that once meant everything to him, was now locked away in an evidence envelope, reduced to a lifeless piece of metal in a criminal file. On the morning of the first trial session, Prosecutor Rebecca Carlisle entered the Marin County courtroom in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, a color chosen to evoke both seriousness and understanding. A deliberate choice aimed at the jury she would spend the next week trying to persuade. Carlisle's opening statement lasted 42 minutes, not a word about courage, no mention of Daniel's years of teaching or volunteer work. Her speech, loaded with persuasive rhetoric, painted Daniel Rigg not as an honorable soldier, but as a predator who used combat skills to threaten innocent youths, a victim or just a campaign tool. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Prosecutor Rebecca Carlisle began, her eyes scanning each face as if reading their reactions more than presenting a case. We are here today because the defendant, Mr. Daniel Rigg, a man trained to kill, chose to threaten 3 young men who were simply having breakfast at a local diner. She gestured toward Tyler Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and Brett Collins, 3 teens in muted suits, seated in the front row with their parents, forming a picture-perfect wall of innocence. They will tell you about the fear they experienced when this man, a former sniper with advanced combat skills, made them understand that they could be harmed in ways they could never imagine. Jennifer Walsh, the defense attorney, half rose from her seat to object, but before she could speak, Judge Morrison calmly interjected. The prosecution will confine their remarks to evidence that will be presented, a warning as soft as cotton, but as sharp as a hidden blade. Carlisle's strategy quickly became clear. She wasn't prosecuting an individual, she was building a distorted cultural symbol. Her first witness was Dr. Marcus Webb, a criminologist from Indiana University, who had coined the term late-onset veteran violence. He had never met Daniel, never reviewed his military records, and knew nothing about the specifics of the case. But his academic credentials silenced the courtroom. Dr. Webb, Carlisle asked, based on your professional experience, do older veterans tend to be more threatening than civilians? Absolutely, he answered without hesitation. Those who've served in war zones like Vietnam often carry what we call conditional lethality. Unlike common criminals who just make threats, these individuals have both the capacity and the instinct to turn threats into action. Jennifer shot up to object. Your Honor, the witness has no specific knowledge of my client's psychological state or personal history. Judge Morrison nodded. Objection sustained. But the damage was done. The words, though cut off, had already seeped into the jury's minds like a slow-burning fuse. The next 3 days were a parade of carefully arranged fragments, all designed to construct Daniel as a dangerous man in a gentleman's disguise. Tyler Morrison was the first to take the stand. His statement had clearly been rehearsed under the prosecution's guidance. He looked at us with these cold eyes like he was sizing us up, figuring out our weaknesses, Tyler said, dabbing a conveniently timed tear. And then he said, I'll never forget it, you kids need to learn some respect, and I know how to teach you in a way you'll never forget. Daniel had never said any such thing, but Tyler's tone was so confident, so composed, that 2 jurors furrowed their brows, as if they truly saw something dangerous in it. Jake Sullivan and Brett Collins followed, delivering carefully polished versions that aligned perfectly with the new truth. Jake claimed that Daniel had bragged about his military past, and said he'd made people disappear before, and the local cops wouldn't be able to stop him if he decided to teach us a lesson. All of it was false, but conveyed with the trembling voices of young men recounting a supposed traumatic experience. Brett layered on the final stroke. When he stood up, it felt like he was evaluating us, like targets. Then he mentioned having connections in the military, people who know how to take care of problems without leaving a trace. These words hit like silent grenades, psychological blows delivered with surgical precision. Prosecutor Carlisle wrapped up her presentation by calling Officer Michael Patterson the arresting officer. On the stand, Patterson described the event with a host of new details that hadn't appeared in his original report. When we arrived at the diner, the suspect was agitated, aggressive, Patterson testified. He kept referencing war and made vague comments about combat. It was clear he wasn't stable. Daniel sat silently at the defense table, watching every word, not out of fear but disbelief. The truth no longer mattered. Only the narrative did. We had to restrain him because he seemed ready to escalate into violence, Patterson declared to the courtroom. A sentence that sounded harmless, but pierced through the truth like a blade. Jennifer Walsh knew it was a lie. Daniel had been fully compliant, never resisted. But she didn't have the resources to dig into Patterson's misconduct history, nor the leverage to dismantle a well-scripted testimony backed by the full weight of the DA's office. Carlisle delivered her final blow by calling the last witness. Dr. Patricia Hicks, a well-known psychiatrist specializing in veteran aggression. She had never met Daniel, never seen his medical records, yet she took the stand under the banner of science. Vietnam veterans often experience late-onset aggressive episodes, Hicks explained. Disrespect from younger generations can re-trigger combat reflexes ingrained during military service. He turned to the jury and looked them straight in the eye. In this case, the defendant, a former sniper, unconsciously reverted to a kill state. He no longer saw those young men as people, but as targets to eliminate. Her statement was chilling, delivered with legal and scientific poise. Despite being entirely speculative and contradicted by numerous peer-reviewed studies that show veterans are not more violent than civilians. But all the jury heard was a woman with the title doctor saying, "His past makes him dangerous." Carlisle didn't miss the chance to drive the emotional climax during her closing argument. She gathered every detail into a pre-built narrative, the explosion of rage from a quiet killer. "The defendant is a soldier trained to kill," she said, her voice measured. "And when he saw 3 young men laughing over breakfast, he decided they needed to be taught a lesson through threats and fear." She paused, then continued, "If it weren't for the quick thinking of these brave young men, we might be looking at a case of assault, or worse." Her gaze swept across the jury. "Mr. Daniel Rigg may have served this country decades ago, but that does not entitle him to terrorize civilians. Your verdict must send a clear message. We do not tolerate the use of military training to instill fear." Throughout the prosecution's case, Daniel sat quietly at the defense table. His expression remained calm, the same calm he had once held in the smoke of war, but his eyes were heavy. He was witnessing the very values he had honored for a lifetime being stripped away, twisted, and used against him. His Purple Heart, once a symbol of saving comrades under fire, was now painted as proof of his capacity to kill. The silver star he had guarded like a sacred relic in his old wooden chest had been forgotten. No one even mentioned it. What stung most was when Carlisle projected a photo of 19-year-old Daniel standing tall in his Marine Corps uniform, face glowing with conviction, eyes sharp with purpose, a young man ready to lay down his life for his country. She pointed at the photo and said, "Look closely. This is a young man trained to kill without hesitation, and that training doesn't fade, it sleeps, waiting to wake." The photo that was once a source of pride for the entire family had now been turned into a weapon, used in a campaign to destroy a man's character. As the prosecution rested its case, Daniel felt a sensation that was strange yet familiar. It was the same feeling he had known in the jungles of Vietnam, the sense of being surrounded, no way to retreat, no air support, no fellow soldiers by his side. But unlike the battlefield back then, there would be no helicopter coming this time, no radio calls back to base, no one with a weapon running in to shield him. This time, he was truly alone. Could Daniel Rigg's defense team mount a meaningful counterattack against a prosecution that had meticulously dismantled his reputation? Could 3 decades of exemplary conduct, dedicated to education and public service, stand against the lies told by 3 privileged teenagers? Jennifer Walsh began her defense under circumstances all too familiar to public defenders across America: understaffed, underfunded, and working with almost no investigative resources. While the prosecution wheeled in 3 crates of files, strategy charts, and exhibits, Walsh had a single briefcase holding 37 pages of notes. She rose to speak, her voice calm, though lacking the steely authority that Carlyle had wielded. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "my client, Mr. Daniel Rigg, is not the predator the prosecution has made him out to be. He's a 66-year-old retired teacher who simply asked 3 rowdy teenagers to quiet down so others could enjoy their meal in peace. That opening was weak, and everyone in the courtroom could feel it. Walsh couldn't probe into the teenagers' juvenile records, had no access to minor infractions from their past, and, most critically, was denied the use of Daniel's military file, which could have shown who he truly was: a dedicated soldier, a respected citizen. The fatal blow came when Judge Morrison ruled, "The defendant's military service record is not relevant to the charges, and therefore That decision not only barred Daniel from being seen for the man he truly was, but created a bitter irony. The prosecution was allowed to use his military past to paint him as dangerous, while the defense was forbidden from using that same history to show his courage, integrity, and honor. In a side conference, Walsh still tried to argue her case. "Your Honor, my client's military record directly contradicts the image the prosecution is portraying. It documents 3 decades of service without a blemish." But Judge Morrison simply shook his head, his voice detached. "Mrs. Walsh, we're not here to try the defendant's biography. We're here to try specific actions that occurred at a diner. His past achievements, however admirable, are not relevant." That was when Walsh fully understood. She was defending a man who wasn't allowed to be defended by the truth. Every further attempt met roadblocks. She requested character witnesses, former students of Daniel from Marin Community College, where he had taught U.S. history for over 30 years. These were people who once learned from him about justice, who wanted to stand up and say he was an inspiring, patient, and compassionate educator. But Judge Morrison again limited the defense. "Character witnesses are repetitive. I will allow only 2 to testify." The first was Dr. Margaret Chen, former chair of the history department, a petite Asian woman in her 70s, with the steady eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime in education. "Professor Rigg was one of the most respected faculty members I've worked with in over 40 years, she said, her voice soft but firm. "There was never a single complaint against him. On the contrary, many students told me that his classes changed the way they viewed America, its justice, its freedoms, and its ideals." In the cold courtroom, as one of the few moments of genuine testimony rang out, Daniel looked down at his hands. The hands that had once held a rifle to protect his brothers in arms, that had once held chalk to teach young minds, and that had now been cuffed in silence. He didn't say a word, but his eyes seemed to ask, "If everything I've done still isn't enough to be believed, then what else must someone like me do to be seen as innocent?" With her usual precision, Prosecutor Carlyle quickly turned Dr. Chen's testimony into a double-edged sword. "Dr. Chen," Carlyle said, her voice smooth and steady, "did you know that Professor Rigg regularly discussed violence in his classroom?" "Mistaught historical violence, yes," Chen replied. "The Civil War, the 2 world wars, and did he share personal experiences from his time in combat? Chen hesitated, then nodded lightly, realizing the trap. Occasionally he shared to help students understand the human cost of war. So he often spoke about killing and violence to students, young, impressionable minds. No, that's not what I said, Chen countered. He helped students grasp history through lived experience, but it was too late. Carlyle didn't need to say more. A devoted teacher who used his experiences to educate was now being painted as a man obsessed with war. Someone who introduced fear into the classroom. The next witness was the only person who had actually been present that day. Maria Rodriguez, the waitress at Murphy's Diner. Handled correctly, Maria's testimony could overturn the entire case. Mrs. Rodriguez, you were working at Murphy's that day, correct? Walsh asked. Yes. I worked there almost every day, Mr. Riggs, a regular. Polite, kind, always tips well. What did you see happen? The 3 boys came in drunk, loud. They were saying awful things about Mr. Riggs because he's black, and he just gently asked them to keep it down. That's all. A simple statement, but one powerful enough to unravel the entire prosecution. But Carlyle once again diverted the focus. She spent over 20 minutes dissecting every corner of Maria's life. Not to disprove the facts, but to discredit the person. Mrs. Rodriguez, you do not currently hold legal work status in the United States, correct? Maria turned pale. I'm applying for my green card, and you understand that testifying today could risk deportation? Objection. Walsh finally shot to her feet. The witness's immigration status has no bearing on what she saw and heard. Sustained, Judge Morrison said, but as usual the damage was done. In the eyes of the jury, Maria was now just someone with a reason to lie. Worse yet, 2 key defense witnesses also disappeared at the last minute. Carlos Mendez, the diner's cook and a direct witness to the event, suddenly called in sick the morning of his scheduled testimony. A later investigation revealed he had received an anonymous phone call threatening to report him to ICE if he testified. Another regular customer, who had been sitting just 3 tables away from Daniel that day, also failed to appear despite promising to do so. When asked, he simply muttered, "My boss said, it's best to stay out of messy stuff like this." Under mounting pressure, Daniel's health began to deteriorate. A shrapnel wound from a battle decades ago in Da Nang, long dormant, suddenly flared up again. His left leg, once injured by a landmine, swelled painfully, turning every step into agony. The pain made him flinch every time he stood during the trial. "Dad, you need to see a doctor," Michelle whispered during a recess. "I can see how much pain." Daniel gritted his teeth, shoulders squared. "I can't let them see me weak. In their eyes, I'm already a threat. If they see an old, trembling veteran, they'll think I'm unstable." But that very pain became a weapon against him. Jurors saw him wince with each step, noticed his hands tremble slightly from the painkillers, saw the silence he kept through visible discomfort, and they interpreted those physical signs as a loss of control. No sympathy, no understanding, just a cold conclusion. This veteran is unstable, just as the prosecution said. He could snap at any moment. The trial's impact didn't stop at Daniel Rigg. It rippled outward, tearing through his family like an invisible wave. Michelle, his daughter, had burned through her savings, traveling back and forth between Chicago and Indianapolis throughout the weeks of court proceedings. Her job at Northwestern Memorial Hospital was in jeopardy as the management grew increasingly frustrated with her repeated absences. Marcus Michelle's teenage son faced cruel taunts at school. One night, on their usual phone call, he choked back tears. They called Grandpa a terrorist, Mom. They said he tried to kill white people. Someone printed his mugshot and taped it inside the school bathroom. The pain wasn't just in the media slander, it was in how society slowly turned its back on someone once respected. Even the community Daniel had been a part of began to pull away. The pastor of Cornerstone Baptist Church, where Daniel had worshipped for nearly 20 years, called him privately and gently suggested he take a break from Sunday services until things are resolved. Old friends with whom he had co-hosted workshops and civic education classes stopped answering his calls. A few sent terse messages. "Hope you understand. We can't be involved right now." "I get it," Daniel told Michelle, his eyes hollow during visitation. "They have families, jobs. They can't stand next to a man the whole city now believes is a criminal." The local media didn't miss the opportunity to stoke the flames. On the fourth day of the trial, Channel 8's Evening News opened with the headline, "Veteran Violence in Our Communities a Growing Threat?" The expert they featured was psychiatrist Dr. Robert Sterling, a man who had never treated a single veteran, but who frequently appeared on TV to opine about everything from psychology to national unrest. "They return from combat zones and never truly reintegrate," Sterling declared. "They see threats everywhere and react with military instinct." On screen, Vietnam War footage played like a ghostly backdrop. Explosions, fallen soldiers, smoke billowing into the air. Each frame seemed to whisper, "This is Daniel Riggs' world." Not a single word about the millions of veterans who served with honor and returned to lead meaningful lives. No one mentioned that Daniel had been a teacher, a father, a model citizen. On the fourth day, during a final strategy meeting with Jennifer Walsh, Daniel was forced to confront a bitter choice: accept a plea deal in exchange for 18 months in prison and 5 years of probation. A part of him wanted to scream. How could he plead guilty to something he didn't do? "To be honest," Walsh said, her voice almost breaking, "they have the upper hand. We're boxed in on every side. If we lose, you could be facing several years behind bars. Taking the deal, it's the safest option." Daniel looked at the young woman sitting across from him, his lawyer, just 28 years old, 3 years into her career, handling her first major case. She had tried, but this battle was brutal, and the law powerless. "Miss Walsh," he said slowly, "if I plead guilty to something I didn't do, then I'm a liar. And if I go to prison for that lie, then this entire system is a lie." Walsh said nothing. For the first time in her fledgling career, she felt something more painful than failure, the loss of faith. That night, as Daniel returned to his cell, he no longer thought about himself. He thought about the young soldiers who once served under his command in Vietnam, the ones he had told America was worth fighting for, that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were ideals worth dying for. Many of them had died with that belief. 50 years later, Daniel had learned that belief could be shattered by the words of 3 privileged teenagers, boys who had sacrificed nothing for their country, but benefited from everything the system had to offer. The Constitution he had once sworn to defend now stood silent before a flood of lies. Because for some, his skin color and service record weren't symbols of honor, they were evidence of guilt. Daniel sat in the courtroom, back straight, eyes forward. In his mind, perhaps, a bitter irony echoed. He was being judged inside a courthouse paid for with the tax dollars he had contributed over 30 years of honest work in a country he had once bled to protect, by people who had never worn a uniform, never heard the crack of a bullet. Justice, he was beginning to understand, was not blind. It sees color, it sees class, and it sees what it wants to believe. Day 5 of the trial. The prosecution's star witness took the stand with the poise of someone who had rehearsed in the mirror for weeks. Tyler Morrison, dressed in a tastefully gray suit, looking younger than his age, sat in the witness chair and looked directly at the jury with eyes carefully trained to appear sincere. Prosecutor Rebecca Carlisle walked to the witness stand with a slow, confident pace, like a playwright approaching the climax of her drama. "Tyler," she began gently, "I want you to tell the jury from start to finish what happened on the morning of March 15 at Murphy's Diner." Tyler took a deep breath as if bracing himself to relive a traumatic memory. "My friends, Jake, Brett, and I had been up all night studying for our midterms. Before heading home, we decided to grab breakfast at Murphy's." He paused for dramatic effect, then raised his hand and pointed directly at Daniel. a calculated move to make the seated man appear threatening even in stillness. And then this man decided we were too loud for him. A few jurors turned to Daniel with suspicious looks. The performance was working. Carlyle guided Tyler like a seasoned director. What happened next? At first he just stared at us. Cold, like he was analyzing each of our weaknesses. Tyler took another pause, then lowered his voice. Then he stood up and walked toward our table. He was tall, intimidating. The way he moved, like someone trained to hurt. The truth, Daniel had never stood up, except when led away by police. But lies, when told skillfully and often enough, begin to feel like truth in the minds of listeners. Did he say anything? Carlyle asked, her tone steeped in faux concern. Tyler nodded, his eyes glistening. Said, and I'll never forget it, kids like you need to learn respect. And I know how to teach you in a way you'll never forget. Then he added, he started talking about the war in Vietnam, about how he handled disrespectful people like us. Though completely fabricated, Tyler's voice trembled just enough to convince those who had never questioned him. How did you feel at that moment? Carlyle asked, lowering her voice as if comforting a victim. I was paralyzed with fear, Tyler replied without hesitation. I wasn't just scared because he was big. I was scared because this was a trained sniper, someone who had killed and was implying he could do it again. Jennifer Walsh stood to object. Hearsay, misrepresentation of the defendant's words. But Judge Morrison allowed Tyler to continue, stating, he's simply expressing how he felt. Once again, truth was sidelined by narrative technique. Tyler, Carlyle said, wrapping up, did you feel your life was in danger? Absolutely, Tyler responded firmly. He made it clear, if we didn't show respect, no cop could protect us from the consequences. Daniel remained still. He had once stood in the jungle, firing to protect his team, had once leapt from helicopters to rescue the wounded, had once taught thousands of students about rights and truth. Now, a teenager who had never worn a uniform, never understood the word sacrifice, was telling a story he never lived. We were just students trying to have a normal breakfast, Tyler Morrison finished, in a voice so soft it seemed harmless. Then a veteran threatened to kill us, just because we were talking like everyone else. For the next 40 minutes, Prosecutor Carlyle walked Tyler through a tightly choreographed series of imaginary events. Each question was like a screw tightening around the image of Daniel Rigg, a trained predator in military clothing, now stalking peace. Tyler performed flawlessly. Each pause for breath, every glance toward jurors, every trembling hand movement, crafted not to tell the truth but to manipulate the emotion. The most dangerous moment came when Carlyle asked, Tyler, can you describe Mr. Rigg's eyes in that moment? Tyler bowed his head, speaking barely above a whisper. They were predator's eyes, like he was deciding which one of us would be the first to get hurt. The courtroom fell silent. Jurors leaned forward, as if they themselves had just felt that stare, kept clenching and unclenching his fists, Tyler continued, like he was imagining strangling us, one by one. Daniel had done no such thing, but the vivid detail created a sense of impending violence in the jury's minds. That imagined clenched fist, though never raised, now hinted at intent, reinforcing the narrative Carlyle had meticulously crafted. Next on the stand was Jake Sullivan. His testimony didn't repeat Tyler's, it escalated it. Jake didn't just confirm the alleged event, he expanded it into a full-blown conspiracy. The defendant kept talking about his military connections, Jake claimed. He said he knew people who could make problems disappear without involving the police, people who knew how to handle things the combat way. A vicious lie, not only slandering Daniel personally, but conjuring a shadowy network of rogue veterans operating outside the law. Truth wasn't being defeated by logic, but by manufactured fear. The final witness, Brett Collins, took the lies to a new level, class warfare. Looked at us and said, "You rich kids think your money will save you? I've killed for this country. Don't think I'd hesitate with you." Brett depicted Daniel not just as angry, but as a man filled with hatred toward the privileged class, a motive some jurors might empathize with or fear. That detail wasn't meant to show Daniel as dangerous, but to make him detestable, someone easier to convict, someone dangerous because he didn't conform to the system. It all culminated when Officer Michael Patterson, already the subject of racial bias complaints, returned to testify. When we arrived at the scene, the defendant was agitated, he said. He kept talking about war, about battles he fought, as if trying to prove he was ready to act at any moment. Daniel Rick, a veteran who once risked his life at the front lines, now sat frozen, encircled by a web of calculated falsehoods. The story had become theater, each witness hitting their marks and reciting rehearsed lines. And Daniel, the only one telling the truth, was the only one no one believed. We had to issue firm commands to get him to comply, Officer Patterson testified, his tone steady and professional, like he was reciting from a police training manual. The truth? Daniel Rigg had cooperated fully during his arrest. He made no resistance, said not a single word of protest. But in Patterson's testimony, delivered in uniform wearing a badge that society often accepts as a symbol of truth, Daniel was portrayed as a potential threat who needed to be subdued, and that was enough to sow doubt in the minds of the jury. Did the defendant say anything that caused you concern about his mental state? Carlyle continued. Yes, ma'am, Patterson replied without blinking. He kept talking about how young people today don't understand respect, and he said that in Vietnam he taught people respect in ways more effective than the police ever could. Daniel had never said that, but Patterson spoke as if relaying facts from a real scene, not reconstructing from imagination, and because he was a police officer, his words carried the presumed weight of official truth. Then came closing arguments, and here Carlyle was no longer a prosecutor. She became the master storyteller of a manufactured tragedy. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice strong and deliberate, you've heard the testimony of 3 students, young people, who were simply trying to have breakfast like anyone else, and you've seen how they were threatened by a man who was trained to protect but instead chose to use that training to intimidate and instill fear. She paused for effect, scanning each juror with a gaze that silently said, "Don't waver. The defendant wants you to believe he's a hero. But what kind of hero threatens to kill students? What kind of patriot uses military skills to terrorize the very people he swore to defend?" Carlyle took 53 minutes to peel away every layer of compassion the jury may have once had for Daniel. His combat service became evidence of violent tendencies. His calm demeanor became a sign of cold calculation. And his age, what should have stood for wisdom, was reframed as years of accumulated resentment. Daniel Rigg is not a victim, Carlyle concluded. He's a man who chose to instill fear. Because those 3 young men didn't call him sir. And if you let that go unanswered, how many more will have to live in fear? Your verdict must send a message. We do not tolerate veterans bringing war to our streets. Jennifer Walsh stood. This was her moment, but her voice had already been stifled long before. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice softer than she'd hoped. My client is not the monster you've just heard described. He's a retired teacher, a 66-year-old man who simply asked 3 young men to lower their voices so others could enjoy a peaceful breakfast. All she had was a few pieces of paper, no rebuttal evidence, no military records allowed, no solid character witnesses, no access to the accuser's histories. She couldn't call former students, former comrades, or anyone who knew Daniel's quiet decency and professional ethics. The truth existed, but it wasn't allowed a voice. Across the courtroom, Daniel watched quietly. In his mind, there were no expectations left, only a bitter question. A lifetime of doing the right thing, can it really be undone by a single lie? Judge Morrison's instructions to the jury appeared neutral, but subtly leaned toward the prosecution like an invisible score behind a play. He emphasized, you must consider the totality of the defendant's behavior, and added, military training may be factored in as an indicator of capacity to make threats. And with those few precise lines, a man who once risked his life for his country was turned into a ticking time bomb. Daniel watched the jurors file out to deliberate. In their eyes, he didn't see doubt or compassion, only coldness, and worse, certainty. They had made up their minds long before entering that deliberation room. The 3 lies told by 3 privileged teenagers had become official truth. A polite request became terroristic threat. A medal of valor became evidence of violence, and an honored veteran became a monster in faded military green. The jury deliberated for exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes, too short to dissect arguments, long enough to elect a foreman, raise hands, and fill in a verdict form. For courtroom veterans, this timeline nearly always means a guilty verdict. For those still clinging to hope, like Michelle, Daniel's daughter, it was a conclusion wrapped in haste. The courtroom was packed when the jury returned. Behind the defense table sat Daniel's family. Michelle sat in the middle, hands clasped tightly. Across the aisle, the Morrison family sat neatly, awaiting a verdict they were already confident would go their way. The press filled every corner, cameras all trained on Daniel's still face. The man about to hear his country call him a criminal. As the jury reached a verdict, Judge Morrison asked. "We have, Your Honor," said Thomas Bradley, the 62-year-old insurance agent serving as foreman, rising to his feet. His hand held the verdict with the resolve of a man convinced he'd done his civic duty, even if it crushed justice. "On the charge of second-degree terroristic threats, what is your verdict?" "We find the defendant, Daniel Ray, guilty." The word guilty dropped like a stone into a dry well. Daniel didn't move. Only the skin around his eyes tightened, a subtle signal of pain too deep to show. Behind him, Michelle gasped. Her sharp inhale sliced through the courtroom like a blade in still air. Across the aisle, Tyler's mother smiled. The smile of someone who believed they'd won a battle that was never fair to begin with. "On the charge of disorderly conduct, what is your verdict?" "We find the defendant guilty." It all took less than 2 minutes, but for Daniel, it was a sentencing 50 years in the making, a life of honesty, service, and sacrifice, dismantled by a few coordinated lies and a system that never let him speak his full truth. Judge Morrison thanked the jury and declared the trial concluded. The final sentence would be handed down the following week after additional investigation and victim impact statements were submitted. But for Daniel Rigg, the real sentence had already been delivered, not by the court, but by a society that had forgotten how to distinguish between a soldier and a shadow. The cold sound of the judge's gavel striking the wood echoed like a final verdict in the minds of everyone present. From that moment on, Daniel Rigg was officially a convicted criminal, even though for the previous 66 years he had been a model citizen, a dedicated Marine, and a teacher with an unblemished record. All of that now belonged to the past, drowned out by false oaths and the blinding glare of media spotlights. The news broke faster than justice ever could. Channel 8 opened its evening broadcast with a blazing red headline. "Veteran convicted of terroristic threats, danger within our communities." The screen was split. On the left, Daniel's mugshot in prison garb. On the right, footage of him in handcuffs being led out of the courthouse. The reporter's voice was urgent, as if they had just witnessed a terror plot being dismantled. The story was told as a resounding victory. "Today's trial is proof of our community's resolve to stand firm against threats, especially those from men who once wore a uniform." Outside the courthouse, Carlisle seized the moment to end her performance with a media punch. Military service, no matter how honorable it seems, does not give anyone the right to threaten innocent lives. Tonight, this city is safer because a dangerous individual has been brought into the light. 1 week later, sentencing. The courtroom became a stage, but this time it wasn't to determine guilt. It was to replay the case through the eyes of the victims. Carlisle was prepared. She brought emotional impact statements, PTSD expert testimonies, all lined up to heighten fear and solidify the narrative. First to take the stand, Tyler Morrison, the boy who opened this tragedy. Wearing a black suit, walking slowly, he spoke in a trembling voice as if still recovering from real trauma. "Your Honor," Tyler began, "what Daniel Rigg did that day completely changed my life. I used to love hanging out with friends, grabbing breakfast, laughing. Now I can't walk into a diner without looking over my shoulder. I don't know if there's another veteran out there who thinks I need to be taught a lesson, because I'm too carefree." He paused, then glanced at Daniel, as if he still posed a threat. Next came Tyler's mother, Patricia Morrison. Her voice wavered but never broke, a performance perfectly calculated. "Our family had to install a full security system around the house," she said, wiping away a tear. "We're afraid that when he gets out of prison, he'll come back." Then she looked Judge Morrison straight in the eye, lowering her voice but sharpening her words. "My son still has nightmares, being hunted by a professional killer who believed my son deserved to die just because he existed in a white boy's body." A subtle but pointed accusation. She never said the word race, but the implication couldn't be missed. Daniel, who had never spoken about skin color, never harbored hatred, was now cast as a symbol of racial animosity. Jake Sullivan, Brett Collins, and their families followed. Each had a story, not true, but delivered in voices soaked in pain. "We were kids, threatened with death by a man trained to kill. Our families lost their sense of safety. Since it happened, my son panics at every loud noise. Each statement, every sentence, targeted not only Daniel, but the judge, the public, and even history itself." Still, Daniel hadn't spoken. He just sat there, thinner now, shoulders sagging, fists clenched, but eyes unwavering. Not because he expected a miracle, but because he understood. This wasn't a court of law anymore. It was a court of image, a court of color, a court that punished silence. The sentencing entered its final phase when Dr. Patricia Hicks, the psychiatrist from trial, returned with a clinical report that was based on no actual evaluation. "Your Honor," Hicks began, her voice honed by years of public speaking, "the defendant's military training, combined with the threatening behavior established at trial, suggests a significant risk of recidivism. Veterans like Mr. Rigg often escalate when initial intimidation fails. They're conditioned to never accept defeat, because they were trained to always win." She had never met Daniel, never reviewed his medical history, but her PhD and confident tone turned speculation into certified truth. And that was the final piece Prosecutor Carlisle needed to justify a sentence harsher than many violent assault cases. Daniel stood when invited to speak before sentencing. He held no notes, no written plea, just a wounded gaze and a slight lean, courtesy of the old injury in his left leg. "I never threatened anyone except on the battlefield," he began, voice calm, "where this country sent me to defend freedom and democracy. I didn't go to Vietnam because I loved war. I went because I believed in what the American flag stood for. I believed in justice. I believed in the right to speak truth without fear of punishment." He looked up at Judge Morrison slowly. "I asked 3 young men to lower their voices in a diner. I didn't threaten to kill them. I didn't raise a hand. I didn't lose my temper. A witness who could confirm that was threatened into silence, and the ones who lied were celebrated." 3 minutes. But in those 3 minutes he showed the full bearing of a soldier who had once survived enemy fire and was now trying to survive a broken system. "I won't apologize for something I didn't do, and I won't disgrace my service by admitting that asking someone to be respectful is an act of terrorism." Judge Morrison, reading the sentence, kept his voice calm, but his words were cold. "Mr. Rigg," he began, "the court acknowledges your military service, but that service does not exempt you from legal responsibility. You used your stature, your military demeanor, and your combat history to intimidate 3 young men who were simply eating a meal." For 10 long minutes, Judge Morrison recited the prosecution's arguments almost verbatim, dismissing Daniel's testimony as a defensive reaction driven by fear of conviction. And then the sentence fell like the final strike of an axe. The court sentences you to 5 years in the custody of the Indiana Department of Corrections with eligibility for parole after serving at least 60% of the term. It was an unusually harsh sentence for a nonviolent offense. But Daniel was no longer being judged as an individual. He had become a symbol, and the punishment was no longer for actions, but for identity and color. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs and ankle chains, a crowd outside erupted. "Lock up the dangerous vet. Justice for Tyler." Signs were raised high. News cameras zoomed in, an image soon to be replayed dozens of times in evening broadcasts. Michelle Reeg, his daughter, collapsed in the back row, sobbing without sound. The father who had taught her about the Constitution, justice, and faith, now buried beneath the very system he once served. The armored transport vehicle rolled out of the Moran County Superior Courthouse, headed for Pendleton Correctional Facility. Daniel Rigg, former Marine, sniper, history professor, the man who once pulled wounded comrades out of gunfire, was now reduced to a frail body, a set of shackles, and a truth no one wanted to hear. But within him remained something no sentence could take: dignity and the memory of what was right. As the last buildings of Indianapolis faded behind the prison van's steel mesh windows, Daniel Rigg quietly looked back on his life and the country he once believed in. He had been convicted by a jury that didn't see him through eyes of fairness, but through the lens of his skin and uniform. He had been sentenced by a judge who didn't choose truth, but chose the path of least resistance for his career. And he had been abandoned by a community that preferred the comfort of lies to the discomfort of an inconvenient truth. But even as the gates of Pendleton slammed shut behind him, Daniel Rigg did not break. Within the gray concrete walls, he still held tight to the truth of what happened that morning at Murphy's. And deep in his heart, a fragile but unwavering hope remained that one day, somehow, justice would appear. What do you think? Was Daniel Rigg given a fair trial? Comment 1 if you believe the court acted within the law, or 2 if you believe the system betrayed an innocent man. Don't forget to hit like if you're outraged by this sentence, and follow the channel, because this story isn't over. Can an innocent man survive prison and still hold on to his honor and principles? Will the truth of that morning ever come to light? And who is the mysterious figure carrying the evidence that could change everything? The next chapter will leave you speechless. Pendleton Correctional Facility doesn't just imprison people, it strips away every personal trace of those who enter. From a name to a wedding ring worn for 43 years, to the steady gaze of a man who once stood against enemy fire. All of it removed, bagged, sealed, and locked in a cold storage room. Daniel endured that humiliation with the same steel discipline that had gotten him through Marine Corps torture, resistance training. But psychological wounds were harder to hide. The guard barked his new identity: Inmate 74,986. D Block, Level 3. Keep quiet, follow orders, and maybe you'll walk out of here alive. His cellmate was Marcus Williams, a 24-year-old from Gary, sentenced to 8 years for armed robbery. The young man entered with the intention of establishing dominance over the old guy he'd be sharing space with, the standard tactic for younger inmates trying to assert control. But the moment he saw Daniel making his bed with precise military Michael folds, Marcus knew this wasn't a man to challenge. "What did they lock you up for, Pops?" Marcus asked, chewing gum and leaning back against the wall. Daniel didn't look up, still smoothing the corners of his blanket. "They said I threatened some college kids." He paused, then added, voice low, "All I really did was ask them to lower their voices in a diner." Marcus let out a laugh. A bitter, cynical sound from someone who'd heard too many absurd reasons from the other side of justice. So now they throw you in here just for breathing while black, huh? Daniel smiled faintly, eyes still fixed on the seam of the blanket. "Not the first time I've been misunderstood," he said, "but maybe this'll be the last time I stay quiet about it." That night, in a damp 12x 8-foot cell, there were two men, one old, one young. One had carried a rifle for ideals, the other for survival. Both were now just numbers. But in that thick darkness, there was one thing no system could strip away: the truth, and the quiet hope to one day step back into the light. "What did you do before this?" Marcus asked, tossing a rubber ball at the ceiling and catching it. Daniel continued, aligning his bed like he was back in the barracks. He taught American history at Marion Community College, 30 years. Then after a pause, his voice dropped. "Before that, 4 tours in Vietnam with the Marine Corps." Just the word Vietnam. And everything in that tiny cell shifted. Marcus, a street-tough kid from Gary with a pistol in his past, suddenly looked at Daniel as if he were a living legend. Somewhere inside, he still held the image of his grandfather, a World War II vet. And even as a convict, Marcus carried a deep respect for those who'd fought for the country. "My uncle was there too," Marcus said softly. "Said it was like hell broke loose." "That's right," Daniel nodded. "But we did what had to be done. Came home and tried to build a better life." Word about Daniel spread quickly through the prison. No need for announcements. The underground communication network inside any correctional facility worked more efficiently than any social media platform. Within a week, even the most hardened inmates were nodding respectfully at the silver-hailed old man in D Block. "That old guy in DB? He fought in Vietnam. He killed communists for this country, then came back to teach kids about freedom. Don't mess with him unless you're asking for trouble." Daniel's daily life behind bars became a quiet symphony of resilience. Each morning, he rose at 5:30 a.m., as he had for nearly half a century. He meditated in silence, waited for the head count, then attended every rehabilitation class the prison offered. But he didn't stop there. He began teaching literacy to younger inmates, helping them learn the alphabet, practice reading, solve basic math problems. Then he coached them on how to write job applications, build resumes, and prepare for the GED. With the same dedication he once brought to his lectures on liberty, 2 weeks in, the first letters began to arrive. At first a few dozen, then hundreds, from veterans in Texas, Minnesota, the Carolinas, California, from local chapters of the American Legion, the VFW, veterans of foreign wars. They sent handwritten notes, books, magazines, messages of support, solidarity, and rage. "We stand with you, brother," wrote Master Sergeant Robert Chen, a Vietnam veteran from Sacramento. "What they've done to you is an insult to everyone who ever wore the uniform. Don't let them break you. Justice will come." Every letter was proof that Daniel wasn't alone, that thousands of people out there didn't believe the courtroom lies that had been so artfully staged. In Chicago, Michelle, his daughter who refused to give up, mortgaged her house to hire appeals attorney David Harrison, a veteran, a lawyer, a man known for overturning wrongful convictions against fellow servicemen. At their first meeting, he said just one sentence: "Your father's trial was a legal disgrace." Then he listed the court's refusal to admit his military records, the intimidation and obstruction of key witnesses, the prosecutor's use of prejudicial language against all veterans. Any one of these could justify a retrial. But they had all three. Still, appeals in Indiana moved slowly. While Harrison meticulously prepared his legal brief, the first ray of hope pierced the wall of deception from the most unexpected place. Patricia Santos, a senior journalist with the Indianapolis Star, who had covered the trial, but had always felt something was off. Santos had quietly launched her own investigation over the past 3 weeks. And then the truth began to emerge. Tyler Morrison had been arrested twice for underage drinking and once for marijuana possession. All swept under the rug thanks to his family's political connections. Jake Sullivan had been suspended from school for cheating. Brett Collins had a sealed juvenile record for assault, erased with the help of his parents' wealth. We weren't in a motion to vacate just yet, but the truth was knocking. While Daniel straightened bed sheets, taught reading, and lived with the discipline of a Marine, Outside, the media machine began to turn in reverse. Why did we believe three privileged students, each with a history of lying and using connections to escape accountability, and turn our backs on a veteran who gave nearly his entire life to this country? That was the question Patricia Santos posed in a series of explosive investigative articles published 6 months after the fateful trial. Line by line, Santos peeled back a truth buried under prejudice and power. These were not innocent college boys threatened by a dangerous veteran. They were young men protected by privilege, and they were believed. Because the man standing across from them was a black veteran. Santos' reporting triggered a storm of public backlash. Civil rights organizations, veteran groups, and legal advocacy networks rose up together. The NAACP dispatched a legal team to review the trial transcript. The Veterans Legal Defense Fund began drafting a federal civil rights lawsuit against Marin County for constitutional violations. And then, 8 months into Daniel's sentence, a phone call from a DHS Webb's Wade changed everything. Michelle, in the middle of a double shift at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, answered the call unaware that fate was on the line. "Are you Michelle Rigg, daughter of Daniel Rigg?" a firm military-like voice asked. "Yes, who's calling, sir?" "You can call me General Samuel Wyatt. I've been searching for your father for over 40 years, and I only just learned about his case from an old friend at the Pentagon." Michelle froze. Her heart pounded, as if her father's past, at long last, had spoken up for itself. "General, I don't understand. What do you know about my dad?" A heavy breath. "Then the truth. In 1973, your father saved my life, along with 37 other soldiers, during an ambush near the Cambodian border. He held his position for 6 hours, using sniper fire to hold back an entire enemy battalion, coordinated artillery, and cleared a landing zone for the medevac helicopters, and was nominated for the Congressional Medal of Honor. But the paperwork was lost in the chaos at the end of the war. And because he was a black man, the military system back then left him behind. I've carried that guilt for 50 years. Michelle held back tears. "Can you help my father, General? Can you testify to what really happened?" Wyatt answered instantly. "I'm flying to Indianapolis tonight. I have in my possession recently declassified documents, a military report proving your father was one of the greatest unsung heroes of the Vietnam War. His trial, it wasn't just a personal injustice. It was an insult to every value this country ever claimed to stand for." When the call ended, Michelle collapsed in the corner of the hospital locker room, not from exhaustion, but because for the first time in nearly a year, she saw a glimmer of light. Maybe this nightmare was nearing its end. Maybe the truth had finally found its voice. And maybe her father would be seen through the lens he truly deserved. In a quiet corner of the Pentagon's bureaucratic machinery, dusty, long-forgotten files were holding the key to clearing Daniel Rigg's name and to exposing one of the most disgraceful cover-ups in the history of the modern U.S. military. "My father's being transferred to a maximum security prison tomorrow morning," Michelle said urgently over the phone. "They claim he's inciting other inmates. If you want to save him, the time is now." "I'll be there before sunrise," the general replied, his tone sharp as a command. "Your father has waited 50 years for justice. He won't wait another day." Michelle hung up, her hand still trembling. Tomorrow would either be a day of liberation or a spiritual death sentence for an innocent man. But at last, for the first time in months, she believed again, believed that somewhere in this country, truth still held value. 6:47 a.m. The Indianapolis skyline was veiled in a thin morning mist. The first sunlight stretched like a blade across the roof of the Marin County Courthouse. A gray military helicopter descended directly onto the parking lot, catching the gathered reporters completely off guard. General Samuel Wyatt, now 71, still standing tall like he had on the front lines of Kandahar, stepped out, holding a leather briefcase filled with documents declassified only months earlier. Documents powerful enough to overturn not just a conviction, but rewrite history. On his chest, ribbons from 3 war zones, Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, gleamed under the morning light. But in his heart, only one thing mattered: restoring the truth for the man who saved his life. Michelle had alerted the media, and as Wyatt climbed the courthouse steps, every camera turned toward him, recording what felt like a moment of history. Behind him were Colonel Patricia Davis, spokesperson for the Department of Defense, and Major James Rodriguez, a military historian who had overseen the tracking of Operation Silent Thunder. Before a wall of microphones, Wyatt paused, adjusted his collar, then spoke in a voice that echoed like he was still addressing a division. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am here today to present evidence that proves Daniel Rigg is not only innocent, but one of the greatest unsung heroes in American combat history." Inside, the legal system shook. News spread so quickly that the state governor personally called the Chief Justice to demand an emergency hearing. Judge Morrison, the man who had sentenced Daniel, now faced a storm of public outcry and pressure from the Department of Defense. He approved a special session that very morning to determine whether the original conviction could survive what was about to be revealed. As Wyatt entered the courtroom, he opened his briefcase. Inside was a story buried for half a century. Operation Silent Thunder, March 26, 1973, near the Cambodian border. He began his testimony, voice steady, deep, and sharp as a blade. "My unit was ambushed by a battalion of North Vietnamese troops. We were trapped in the jungle, wounded, bleeding, no way out. It felt like the end, until one sniper volunteered to hold the line, facing the enemy alone for 6 straight hours. That sniper was Sergeant Daniel Rigg. We had been tasked with tracking NVA troop movements," General Wyatt testified, locking eyes with the judge. "But we walked straight into a carefully planned trap. An enemy company flanked us from 3 directions. 3 of my men were killed instantly. The rest of us were wounded, feeling indignant that we had no chance of survival unless someone held them off." He paused. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for the next sentence. That man was Corporal Daniel Rigg. He positioned himself on a ridge over 800 meters away, armed with his M40 sniper rifle and an unbreakable will. For 6 relentless hours, Daniel neutralized machine gun nests, eliminated mortar teams, and picked off enemy squad leaders with surgical precision. Each shot was deadly but not cold. They were purposeful, guided by a higher mission: saving lives. "Corporal Rigg took out 43 enemy soldiers that day," Wyatt said, his voice catching. "But more importantly, he saved 37 Americans, including me. I stand here today because of him. And for that, I will speak the truth, no matter the cost." When Wyatt submitted the declassified documents, the courtroom collectively held its breath. There it was, the original Medal of Honor nomination for Daniel Rigg, signed by Lieutenant Colonel William Carson. Attached was a report from every surviving soldier from the 1973 ambush, each affirming that without Daniel, the entire unit would have been wiped out. But when Carson died in a helicopter crash 3 weeks later, no one followed up on the paperwork, and what followed was a silent betrayal. "We discovered a series of internal Pentagon memos," Colonel Patricia Davis explained, holding a printed page from a file suppressed for 50 years, called Feeling Unbon from a high-ranking official, name redacted, reads, "The nation's highest military honor should not be awarded to a black soldier. It would send the wrong message about leadership in the armed forces, and it could inspire the wrong kind of thinking among minority troops." The courtroom was stunned. No one wanted to believe it, but the ink on the page was undeniable. The truth hadn't been denied because of a lack of courage, but because of color. Daniel, the unsung hero, had been buried not for military reasons, but because of the entrenched racial prejudice embedded in the military structure of his time. Immediately following the emergency hearing, the news exploded nationwide. Television networks aired a special report, "The Forgotten Hero," and a verdict built on lies. On social media, the hashtag Justice for Daniel Rigg quickly rose to the #1 national trend. The American Legion issued an emergency statement. "This verdict is a slap in the face to every soldier who ever fought for America." Veterans of foreign wars called on Congress to hold a national hearing, Politicians began to backpedal. Indiana Governor Jennifer Martinez declared, "This trial is a stain on our state's commitment to justice. We are demanding immediate review and full restoration of Mr. Riggs' honor." Senators from both parties, rarely in agreement, called for federal intervention. The White House released a brief statement saying President Williams was deeply concerned by the revelations in Daniel Riggs' case, but the most shocking moment came from a video played during the emergency hearing. General Samuel Wyatt, eyes still burning with battlefield fire, stood before the court and played the final file from a sealed red USB drive marked by the F. On screen appeared Tyler Morrison, disheveled, stripped of his usual arrogance. He looked straight into the camera, his voice shaking. "We made it all up. Mr. Riggs never threatened us. He just asked us to keep our voices down. But we were drunk and thought he had no right to talk down to a bunch of white college guys. We knew no one would believe a black old man, so we lied." The video froze on Tyler lowering his eyes, unable to look at himself. The courtroom went still. That sentence, short, blunt, was not just a confession, it was a mirror held up to a society steeped in bias. Jake Sullivan and Brett Collins appeared in subsequent clips, admitting their complicity in the fabricated testimony. They revealed the Morrison family's attorney had coached them to lie in sync. They were promised they'd never be prosecuted as long as they stuck to the story. Before the public, prosecutor Rebecca Carlisle held a press conference with a rigid smile. "If new evidence casts doubt on the verdict, our office will give it serious consideration." But no one believed her. Carlisle, who once used the case to fuel her campaign for mayor, was now seen as a symbol of power corrupted by ambition. Overnight, her approval ratings plummeted. The press branded her a career built on someone else's suffering. Meanwhile, a wave of justice surged through the nation. Thousands gathered outside Pendleton Correctional Facility. Veterans wore armbands that read, "Daniel Riggs, the honor our hero." A convoy of motorcycles stretched for miles along Interstate 70, led by veterans in full uniform, silent but proud. Inside, Daniel Bernheim, once broken in silence, sat in the prison's rec room, watching the news. He saw Tyler's face. He heard every word of the confession, and for the first time in 18 months behind bars, he laughed, not out of vindication, but because, at last, truth was allowed to breathe. As the Indianapolis sky dimmed with the hues of dusk, emergency petitions flooded both state and federal courts. Veteran groups submitted hundreds of formal demands for a decision by nightfall. Civil rights organizations called for investigations into prosecutorial misconduct. Social media erupted with hashtags "Free Daniel Riggs," "True Hero," "Justice Delayed, Not Denied." Meanwhile, General Wyatt, seated in his Marriott hotel room, sleepless, revised his final statement. After 50 years of guilt for not being able to secure justice for the man who saved his life, he now prepared for a fateful morning where the debt of gratitude would be repaid with truth, light, and honor. 8 o'clock a.m. the next day. The Marin County Courthouse was packed. No empty seats. No more silence. Reporters, veterans, activists, students, citizens, all gathered. Some came to witness justice restored. Some came to apologize to a hero betrayed, and others came to watch history change. From the bench, Judge Morrison sat like stone. No one needed him to speak it aloud, but all could see. His career was over. The wrongful conviction he had overseen was now considered an indelible stain on Indiana's judicial history. Then he delivered the final ruling, each word deliberate, like a solemn act of atonement. "Mr. Riggs, this court finds that your conviction was based on fabricated testimony. With the decisive new evidence presented, all charges are hereby dismissed, permanently with prejudice." The courtroom erupted in applause and tears, but Daniel, standing at the defense table in his orange prison uniform, only nodded. No cheering, no tears, just the glint in his eyes, like a man who had finally laid down the mountain of sorrow on his shoulders. General Wyatt sat in the front row, silent. After 50 years of guilt, he could finally take a full breath without feeling the weight of shame. Daniel Rigg walked out of Pendleton Correctional Facility at 2:37 p.m. that day into a sea of cheering people. Over 5,000 had gathered, including veterans from across the Midwest, forming an honor guard lining both sides of the prison gate. Michelle, the daughter who never lost faith, was the first to run to him. They embraced, surrounded by hundreds of cameras, capturing a moment destined to become an indelible image in American history, a symbol of delayed justice, but not dead justice. General Wyatt stepped forward. He stood at attention, clenched his right fist, and gently tapped it over his heart, the way American soldiers honor comrades who gave their lives. Sergeant Rigg, I owe you an apology that's 50 years overdue. You saved my life and 37 others. But this country forgot you. Today I stand here to say your sacrifice has finally been recognized. Daniel took his hand and gripped it firmly. General, we only did what soldiers are meant to do. Keep the oath and live in a way that honors those who didn't make it home. In the weeks that followed, Daniel Rigg transformed from a convicted terrorist into a national symbol of restored honor and justice. Major news outlets lined up to interview him. Universities invited him to speak on resilience and public ethics. The nation listened to a man who had once been forgotten. Meanwhile, Rebecca Carlisle, the once ambitious prosecutor, withdrew from the mayoral race just 3 days after Daniel's release. She was later placed under federal investigation for knowingly prosecuting a false case. Her law license was revoked. Carlisle became the antithesis of Daniel, a living example of power corrupted by ambition. 2 officers, Michael Patterson and Jennifer Walsh, who had arrested Daniel based on falsified reports, were terminated from the Indianapolis Police Department and faced charges for violating civil rights under color of law. The sentence for Tyler Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and Brett Collins was also handed down. Perjury, false testimony, and conspiracy to deprive civil rights each received 18 months in prison. The Morrison family declared bankruptcy following a civil lawsuit judgment. Tyler's parents, key orchestrators of the legal smear, were also prosecuted. Ultimately, Daniel filed a civil suit seeking compensation for the 18 months of wrongful imprisonment. The court awarded $15,700,000, the largest settlement in Indiana history for a wrongful conviction involving a veteran. But Daniel didn't keep it all for himself. I'll use most of the money to create the Daniel Rigg Foundation to fund legal defense for wrongfully convicted veterans. I never want to see another soldier who gave blood for this country stand in a courtroom criminalized for doing the right thing. 6 months after his exoneration, Daniel Rigg, a once ranked convicted veteran and Marine sniper who saved an entire platoon, was invited to Washington, D.C. for a ceremony that should have happened in 1973. At the famous White House Rose Garden, beneath soft morning sunlight and waving flags, President Williams stepped up to the podium. Standing before the national flag, he solemnly placed the blue ribbon around Daniel's neck and presented him with the Medal of Honor, the highest military award for valor in the United States. Sergeant Daniel Rigg, the president began, you didn't just save 37 brothers in arms in the jungles of Vietnam. You reminded this entire nation that courage lives not only on the battlefield, but in the unwavering stance of a man facing injustice. In the front rows, survivors of the patrol team, now elderly, gray-hailed and leaning on canes, couldn't hold back tears. They had flown in from across the country, bringing photos of wives and kids, faded medals, and dreams long unspoken, just to witness their hero honored at last. The hug between Daniel and General Wyatt, silent but filled with meaning, closed a debt of honor 5 decades long. But Daniel didn't stop at receiving a medal. He was invited to testify before the House Judiciary Committee during a special session on judicial reform and veterans' rights. No speech, no grandstanding, just his steady, deep voice. What happened to me is not an exception. It is the inevitable result of a system where the drunken words of 3 white college boys are given more weight than the truth of a black veteran, where my loyalty and patriotism as a soldier were twisted into proof that I was dangerous. Daniel's testimony more powerful than any statistic or legal theory, shifted the tide of public discourse. Soon after, Congress passed the Veterans Justice Act. It mandated all judges and prosecutors receive specialized training for handling cases involving veterans, federal oversight of counties with patterns of discriminatory prosecution against people of color or discharged military personnel. Across the country, a new conversation began about truths long ignored. People often asked, what about the community that turned its back on him? The answer brought many to tears. Cornerstone Baptist Church, which once politely asked Daniel not to attend during the trial, now held a formal welcoming ceremony and issued a public apology before the entire congregation. They raised funds to establish a scholarship in his name and pledged to retell Daniel's story to future generations every year. Marion Community College, where he taught for 30 years, renamed its history department the Daniel Riggs Center for Justice Education. His first lecture after returning packed with students, professors, and even members of the public. And then there was one more place, Murphy's Diner, where it all began, where he once simply asked 3 young men to lower their voices, where he nearly lost everything. Now it has become a pilgrimage site for thousands, not to eat breakfast, but to see with their own eyes where justice almost died. 1 year after his release, Daniel Riggs returned to the place where it all started, Murphy's Diner. The small diner on East Washington Street, once the backdrop of his wrongful arrest, has become a national symbol of justice restored. Outside, a small brass plaque had been mounted next to the window in honor of Sergeant Daniel Riggs, Medal of Honor recipient, for his unyielding pursuit of justice. Inside his old booth, where he once sat, is now a memorial corner. A section of wall recounts Daniel's story in respectful lettering. Alongside a photo of him in uniform, Daniel sat down and ordered his usual black coffee, no sugar. Surrounded by the familiar clatter of dishes and breakfast chatter, he leaned back and reflected on the journey from a devoted teacher to a wrongfully convicted prisoner, and now a national symbol of truth and resilience. Throughout the morning, groups of young people approached his table, some asking for photos, others just wanted to shake his hand. A group of black high school students timidly came over, their eyes glowing with newfound purpose. "Mr. Riggs, we want to study law. To protect people like you?" And your story showed us that truth can be forgotten, but it never dies. Daniel smiled, heart stirred by memories of young soldiers he once led in the jungles of Vietnam. Just as uncertain, just as full of hope. Truth always wins. Sometimes it just shows up later than we hope. As the crowd thinned, he opened the Indianapolis Star, as he did every morning. On the front page, a photo showed him standing with 12 young students. The headline read, "Daniel Riggs Foundation awards first scholarships to law students committed to justice." The bold letters stamped a message into the soul of a once silent America. Man destroyed by lies had been resurrected by truth, and the journey is far from over. Daniel still visits Murphy's Diner every week, still sits in the same corner, still watches over the next generation writing the next chapter of his dream, a justice system that sees beyond race, rank, or background. What do you think about this story? Comment 1 if you believe truth will always prevail. Comment 2 if you believe more reform is needed to stop injustice from repeating. If this journey of restored honor moved you, hit like and follow to stay with us for more stories to come. Which story should we tell next? Another veteran wrongfully convicted? An ordinary citizen taking on a broken system? A case buried in darkness that you believe needs light? Because every American deserves the truth, and every hero deserves to be called by the right name. The story of Daniel Riggs is not just the tragedy of one man. It is a mirror reflecting the cracks in a justice system where skin color can still outweigh truth and honor can be buried by 3 lies. He is living proof of a painful paradox, that even with a medal for valor on your chest, even after 30 years as a model teacher, you are not immune to prejudice. When a system chooses to believe a lie, 3 white boys with innocent faces can destroy an entire life. But the most powerful thing about this journey, it is not the overturned conviction, not the medal returned. It's that Daniel kept his dignity. Through 18 months of wrongful imprisonment and never bowed his head, He refused to plead guilty in exchange for freedom. He didn't abandon faith in the country that once betrayed him. Truth may lose its voice, but it never loses its power. His story is also a tribute to investigative journalism and justice advocates. Had it not been for Patricia Santos, a journalist, or General Samuel Wyatt, America might have lost a hero to the shadows. Daniel Rigg chose to turn personal pain into public purpose by founding a fund to protect wrongfully convicted veterans. By using his name to shine light on forgotten cases, he showed us that a hero isn't someone who never falls. It's someone who stands back up, even when the entire system tries to hold them down. The question we must all ask ourselves is this: does justice truly exist, or does it only appear when the spotlight hits? Do we dare demand transparency from those in power? Do we have the courage to speak out when the innocent are crushed, even if they don't share our skin color or social status? If Daniel's journey has reignited your belief in justice, hit like to help this story reach further. Click follow and turn on notifications, because we'll keep telling the stories of silent heroes, veterans who were forgotten but never stopped fighting. What story would you like to hear next? A case that was never covered by the media? Another soldier wrongfully convicted in silence? Or an ordinary person who did something extraordinary to stand up to injustice? Drop your suggestions in the comments, because truth deserves to be told. Because every American deserves fairness, and every soldier deserves to be honored